Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Rise of the Robots, a tournament fighting game developed by Mirage and published by Time Warner Interactive for both the Amiga and DOS computer platforms in 1994, along with a number of ports to other platforms, including the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Sega Game Gear, Philips CDI, and, in an interesting twist, the arcades. We're going to look at that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 108. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges, monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Rise of the Robots. Rise of the Robots is a one-on-one fighting game developed by Mirage and published by Time Warner Interactive for both the Amiga and DOS computer platforms in 1994, along with a bunch of ports to both consoles and arcades following. Before we can talk about Rise of the Robots, we need to take a step back and once again take a look at the tournament fighting game genre of the early 90s, a style of game that became incredibly popular in arcades around the world, driven primarily by the competitive multiplayer nature of the genre, coupled with the high skill ceilings to master individual fighters and their various special, combo, and finishing moves, many of which were unpublished at the time, forcing players to spend quarter after quarter in the hopes of becoming more proficient at their favorite fighting game title. And even beyond improving an individual player's own proficiency, the act of competing against other humans provided infinite replayability, as each individual came with their own strengths to counter, weaknesses to exploit, and styles to learn. It was not uncommon in the early 90s to see a row of quarters lined up on an individual arcade machine, each one representing an individual combatant's place in line, as players waited to take on the current reigning champion. For those who experienced it firsthand, it was truly a magical time, and for the most part, the arcade fighting game scene was dominated by two main titles, Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. Street Fighter II was the sequel to Capcom's original Street Fighter title, a tournament fighter that was originally developed and published back in 1987. The first Street Fighter was based on a concept by Takashi Nishiyama, who, after working on the influential side-scrolling beat-em-up title Kung Fu Master, had an epiphany. What if a game could essentially be a series of boss fights, rather than placing bosses at the end of a level that you had to defeat a ton of minions to reach? You could keep the same fighting gameplay, but by shifting the focus to be one-on-one encounters with powerful opponents, you might be able to ratchet the tension up and, in the process, deliver absorbing gameplay, even though you weren't mowing down waves of bad guys. Street Fighter would end up refining, and in some cases defining, various mechanics that would continue to evolve the state of the one-on-one fighting game. The game would feature tournament-style gameplay where the player would select from one of several distinct, detailed characters at the start of the game, with the intent of traveling the world and beating other characters in one-on-one melee-centric combat. Rather than model itself after a one-hit, one-point kind of mechanic, which had been the norm up to this point, Street Fighter would feature life bars for each character, taking a page out of the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre. Each character would have access to a full suite of moves and combinations, and in what would be a first for the tournament fighting genre, the game would include a series of unpublished special moves that, should the player figure out the right combination of joystick and button presses, would unleash a devastating attack that could turn the tide of battle in an instant. The key to victory was learning your character, as each character in Street Fighter was unique and had their own traits and moves to contend with. This, for all intents and purposes, was the start of the next generation of fighting titles. Capcom would follow Street Fighter with the direct sequel in 1991, Street Fighter II, though to simply call Street Fighter II a sequel would be a bit reductive, as it would represent one of the biggest leaps in quality and features ever seen when compared to an immediate predecessor. Street Fighter II would keep the foundational elements that the original title put in place, like the concept of a worldwide tournament with various characters, stages, and movesets. But it would iterate and improve upon nearly every aspect of that formula. Graphics and animations were incredibly detailed, with large, chunky sprites giving each combatant their own personality, while separate stage music, all of which was absolutely awesome, would enhance the action. Further, each character would receive a full complement of special moves and combos, which, assuming you practiced enough, would give you a leg up over the competition. Street Fighter II would prove immensely popular amongst arcade goers, and would go on to become the third highest grossing video game of all time, accumulating over $10 billion in sales over its lifetime. That is a lot of quarters. With Street Fighter II's success, a number of other companies would start to release their own fighting games, hoping to grab a piece of the proverbial fighting game pie that Street Fighter II was currently enjoying. One of those companies, and the eventual creator of a series that would directly compete against Street Fighter for years to come, was arcade game development studio Midway, who tasked two of their most creative designers, John Tobias and Ed Boon, to come up with a game that could rival Street Fighter II's success. As longtime listeners of our podcast likely recall, the game born out of that request was none other than Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat represented a very different take on the fighting game genre, with a focus on digitized actors and over-the-top violence, as opposed to Street Fighter II's more cartoon-styled visuals that, while no less violent, contained much less gore, a fact that was not lost on many politicians who declared Mortal Kombat to be a hazard to the youth of the world, a true gateway drug to causing violence in real life as opposed to the digitized blood splatter that accompanied every successful punch, uppercut, and kick in the virtual world of the game. Mortal Kombat, along with other controversial titles like Doom and Night Trap, would lead a number of countries to create video game ratings boards to help protect younger gamers from potentially seeing or playing something they may not have been mature enough for. And as you might expect, the ratings worked absolutely flawlessly, as Mortal Kombat and its ilk would be 100% blocked off from younger players, and society as a whole would be all the better for it. Only that's not what happened at all, and in fact, the controversy of Mortal Kombat led players young and old to want to play it more, which is a major reason why Mortal Kombat would end up competing fairly closely with Street Fighter II and its massive fighting game market share. While Mortal Kombat wouldn't be quite as successful as Street Fighter II over its lifetime, it was certainly a big deal in 1992 and 1993, where the game would maintain either first or second place in gross arcade sales for multiple months following its release, alternating certain months with another Midway Classic arcade title, NBA Jam. While Mortal Kombat presented a different take on the tournament fighter in comparison to Street Fighter II, it would also prove to be immensely popular, and around this time, there were effectively two camps of players that hung out in many arcades. Some enjoyed the deeper combo system and cartoon-styled visuals of Street Fighter II, while others enjoyed the more visceral and bloodier action of Mortal Kombat. And for years following their respective releases, these two arcade titles reigned supreme in the fighting game space, both in arcades as well as on home consoles as a result of high-quality ports that brought the arcade action home for individuals to enjoy in the comfort of their living rooms. Now, up to this point, we've talked about Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat from the perspective of competitive multiplayer, that is, one human facing off against another human, a style of gameplay that would deliver incredibly fun, deep, and engaging encounters where you literally had to outplay and outsmart your very human opponent in order to emerge victorious. But what if you didn't have a friend or enemy to play against? Well, in that case, you would have to play against computer-controlled combatants as controlled by each game's artificial intelligence routines. The unfortunate fact for solo gamers, though, is that for fighting games around this time, artificial intelligence was almost universally artificial, and very rarely approached anything resembling intelligence. Back in the early 90s, typical fighting game AI routines would involve the computer reading a player's inputs and choosing how to react to that input, with the degree to which an AI responded correctly being a factor of what difficulty settings the game was configured with. On the default difficulty mode for many arcade titles around this time, these games would be designed to eat unskilled players' quarters fairly reliably, though individuals who had memorized and mastered the game's various characters and movesets could oftentimes emerge victorious. On harder difficulty settings, though, which devilish arcade operators could set via internal jumpers and debug menus, the computer would literally cheat in order to win, making victory, even for highly skilled players, an exercise in frustration. Imagine you're playing poker with someone, and they not only know your cards, but they also know which cards are going to come next in the deck. That person would have a pretty insurmountable advantage, and that's exactly the same kind of advantage that most fighting game AI routines would enjoy around this time. Ask anyone who played Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter II in the arcade against the computer how they found the experience, and I would venture a guess that for all but the most expert players, the answer will almost undoubtedly be infuriatingly difficult. But Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II were far from the only tournament fighting games in town, and with their respective success, a number of companies would continue to attempt to bring their own fighting titles out to the market, some of which would end up being uninspired clones of one title or the other, while other more innovative companies would attempt to create something entirely new that players had never seen before. And it was this latter goal that would drive game development studio Mirage to decide to enter the fighting game arena with their own take on the tournament fighter. Mirage was a UK-based company founded in 1992 as a spin-off of the much larger simulation and strategy game development studio Microprose, and Mirage, like many video game startups around this time, had a bit of an identity crisis early in its life, primarily because the company didn't really have a firm direction or style that they wanted to adhere to for their eventual games. They knew they wanted to create and publish games, but as far as what kinds of games to actually work on, that was entirely up in the air. The only thing they did know was that they wanted to become a successful company, which meant they would have to deliver experiences that would wow gamers and hopefully cause them to want to spend their hard-earned money on Mirage-developed games. Mirage's first release was a strategy title called Ashes of Empire, which received fairly good reviews but had limited overall sales, with some reviewers believing the game was a bit too dry and detail-oriented in its subject matter to appeal to the mass market. Your overall goal with the game was to bring peace to 5 different Republic nations through a mix of diplomacy and real-time first-person tank combat combined with strategic decisions that would ultimately determine how successful your peacekeeping actions would end up being. I haven't personally played this one, but I will say based on the gameplay videos I watched, it seems like it had an interesting mix of combat and strategy, though admittedly, it was a bit challenging to understand exactly what was going on in the game without playing it myself, which might have been one of the reasons Ashes of Empire was a bit of a tough sell to potential consumers. Mirage would end up publishing several titles after Ashes of Empire, with their biggest claim to fame being the publishing of the hit puzzle platform title The Humans, which was itself inspired by the incredibly popular puzzle game Lemmings, a title we actually talked about all the way back in episode 1 of our podcast. The Humans would present a similar kind of gameplay setup as Lemmings, with multiple tools and skills available for the titular humans to utilize in order to complete each level of the game, a construct that gamers and critics alike ended up enjoying immensely. The Humans was a huge success, and would spawn multiple sequels and an expansion pack, and both Imagitech Design, the game's developer, and Mirage, the game's publisher, would enjoy solid sales from the title. For Mirage, this success was something they had been banking on, as the reason they decided to publish The Humans in the first place was because Lemmings had just recently come out, and Mirage figured that they could just piggyback on that popularity by publishing a similar title to hopefully capture some sales from gamers who wanted more puzzle platforming action after completing Lemmings. This, like I mentioned, is effectively what happened, and with The Humans' success, Mirage began to look across the rest of the gaming landscape to determine what their next game was going to be, and in the process, they were keen to replicate the model they had just successfully exploited, which was to find a popular genre and release a new, hopefully quality title in that genre, in an attempt to capture market share from whomever the leader was at the time, or at a minimum, at least to make some money. So, Mirage began to do some research about what games were popular amongst gamers, and here they recognized that the one-on-one tournament fighter was effectively taking over arcades, between Street Fighter II's and Mortal Kombat's dominance, as well as making inroads in the home with 16-bit ports of those and other fighting titles to Nintendo, Sega, and computer systems. Mirage was intrigued by the significant sales these kinds of titles were generating, though they weren't 100% convinced that they themselves would be able to create a game to compete with these fairly large industry juggernauts. So, they sat down to begin playing the games, and here they came upon an interesting revelation. From their perspective, fighting titles of the time, and in particular the mega-popular Street Fighter II, just weren't all that special. Sure, they were fun, but the graphics weren't dramatically better than other titles of the time, and even games like Mortal Kombat and its digitized characters were viewed as interesting, but not all that great. And beyond the graphics, Mirage felt like the games didn't give single players an experience that was worth their time, with artificially difficult computer-controlled characters that didn't behave like a human opponent, making it so that if you wanted to really enjoy a tournament fighting game, you had to find a buddy to play it with. From Mirage's perspective, these issues and others could be solved, and they believed they would be the company to do it, which is what prompted them to begin developing the game that would eventually be known as Rise of the Robots. As the Mirage team began to plan out the development timeline for the game, they knew they wanted to focus on 3 areas that they believed would make their fighting title better than any other game that had come before it, those being graphics, music, and artificial intelligence. From a graphical perspective, Mirage had believed that current titles of the time weren't taking advantage of true bleeding-edge technology, which as of the early 90s was the concept of pre-rendered computer-generated imagery, or as it was more commonly known, CGI. Hollywood films like The Abyss and T2 Judgment Day had shown what was possible with CGI, and for many across a variety of industries, CGI was a buzzword that was supposed to signify the future of graphics and entertainment. Mirage knew they wanted to incorporate CGI into their title, and what better way to showcase that technology than to create a game with a bunch of robots doing combat with one another. Like I just mentioned, the second Terminator film had just recently been released in theaters, and due to its astronomical success, robots and other cybernetic creatures were on everyone's minds, including the staff at Mirage. The team decided that using CGI to create highly detailed robotic characters that players could control would provide a fighting experience ripped right out of the movies, so they set out to make that graphical vision a reality. The graphics artists at Mirage began working on the designs that would eventually be morphed into the various robot characters that would make up the game, beginning by creating a series of wireframe models using popular graphics program 3D Studio, and then stretching those wireframe models to fit the overall design and proportions for each individual robot. If the team was designing a massive robot intended for moving cargo, then they'd stretch the wireframes out to be broader and with wider dimensions than if they were designing a more svelte robot that might be used for eliminating vermin, just as an example. These designs would continue to morph over time until the team was happy with the end result, after which the team began rendering the models into a form they could hopefully use in the game. Additional texture maps would be created to make the robots look more realistic rather than super clean and smooth CGI-driven images, and with that combination of hand-drawn textures and 3D pre-rendered visuals, the game's 7 robotic combatants would be brought to life, with extra attention placed on the game's main protagonist, the Cyborg. Because the Cyborg was intended to take on a more humanoid appearance than the other industrial robots that made up the game, additional focus had to be placed on ensuring the Cyborg looked more realistic, with the art team using various bodybuilding magazines to help them model the musculature and anatomy that they'd eventually render onto the final robot. A step that was probably not 100% necessary, but did show the team's attention to detail, which they hoped would result in visuals that gamers had never seen before in a fighting title. Equal attention would be placed on the creation of the game's artificial intelligence engine, where, like I mentioned earlier, the team wanted to create an experience much more similar to playing against real human opponents, with computer-controlled characters that would learn a player's moves, strategies, and styles, and then react accordingly, rather than simply reading user inputs and responding with an appropriate counterattack a certain portion of the time. To do this, the game would make extensive use of probability, statistics, and data tables to model each robot's behavior, with a combatant's skill ultimately being determined based on a combination of several modifiers, such as strength, intelligence, speed, and motivation. The thought was, if a robot was more intelligent, then it would have a better chance of responding to a player's moves with a more accurate counterattack. The ability of that counterattack to land would be driven by the speed and strength of the robot, which human players could potentially respond to if their own agility was better than the incoming attack. Even beyond those stat-based maneuvers, the game was designed to capture user inputs in a series of data tables, allowing the computer to actually learn a player's style and respond with its own modified style to hopefully counter the player in a more realistic way than most fighting games of the time. As an example, let's say you, as the player, really like to execute a flying kick. Well, the first couple times you're fighting a certain computer character, you might land the move without issue. But eventually, the computer would learn that you really like those flying kicks, and it would begin to get quote-unquote smarter, with better defenses against that move and better counterattacks designed to limit your ability to constantly use that maneuver, the same way a human player would often respond to another player in a competitive match. We'll talk more about my own opinion as to how well these AI routines worked in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, there was significant effort in making Rise of the Robots a unique, less artificially intelligent fighting experience. From a musical perspective, the team knew that they could create their own soundtrack, but they figured that a game of the caliber they were trying to create could only be complemented by professional audio, which is why they signed Brian May, Queen's lead guitarist, to compose the soundtrack for the game. As with the graphics and AI, Mirage wanted to create an experience for gamers that was unlike anything they had seen before, and with original Brian May compositions acting as the audio backdrop for the game, they truly believed they were on the verge of releasing something special. In the middle of the game's development cycle, Mirage had the opportunity to show off their progress during the 1993 Summer Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, where the press was wowed by the game's visuals and futuristic robot fighting action, leading Mirage to believe that all of their work was worth it. They were making a true hit title. This was followed by a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign where discussions focused on not just the release of the game, but also various tie-in products and media like toys, novels, comics, animated television series, and even the potential of an actual Hollywood-produced theatrical release. It looked like Mirage was about to create the next big media franchise. Now, all they needed to do was actually complete work on the game. Here, though, some issues started arising that would drive not only delays to the overall release date, which was intended to be February of 1994, but would also result in some concessions being made in order to allow the development team to finally complete their work on the title, with one of the biggest issues being the time required to render each individual robot character that the team had designed. Like we talked about, Rise of the Robots was going to be a CGI showcase, using the latest technology in computer graphics to create a visual feast for the eyes. The only issue was, with all of that advanced computer imagery, the horsepower to actually render that imagery was higher than what the team had ever realized, and each individual robot character took 2 months to render completely. That's right. Each fully textured model, coupled with the various animations and poses that the robots needed in order to actually execute their fighting moves, required 2 months of actual render time to complete. By the time early 1994 rolled around, the team realized that they literally didn't have enough time to fully render every robot in the game from all of the different perspectives that the game required. So they made the decision to limit the first player to only being able to control the game's cyborg robot, while the opposing combatants would be the other 6 robots in the game, which meant that each robot only needed to be rendered from a single perspective, as opposed to being rendered to reflect both a left-facing and right-facing version of the character. This also meant that in a multiplayer game, Player 1 would only be able to play as the cyborg, while Player 2 would be able to play as any of the 6 other characters, but could also never choose the cyborg for him or herself. Certainly an interesting design concession, but one that was necessary if the team was ever going to have the game see the light of day, simply because of how much time it took to render this advanced CGI-driven imagery. Another issue impacting the game's release was the fact that Brian May's composed soundtrack for the game was delayed by his record company, which placed the Mirage team at a bit of a crossroads. Should they delay the release of their own game even more as they waited for May's soundtrack, or should they move forward without its inclusion? The team ultimately decided to settle for including snippets of a single track from one of Brian May's prior albums, entitled The Dark, rather than have a fully original soundtrack for the game. Otherwise, who knew when the game was going to actually be able to come out? Eventually, despite the delays, and because of the concessions the team had to make in the game's overall design, Rise of the Robots would finally release on the market in November of 1994 for various Amiga platforms, with ports to a number of different platforms including DOS, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, 3DO, and even arcades in the months that would follow. Mirage had succeeded in bringing its futuristic fighting title to market. Now, the only question was, could it stand toe-to-toe with industry heavyweights like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat? The short answer, according to most critics and players, was no, it could not. In fact, in a move that we now realize is oftentimes a way of hiding a poor game from the critical press, reviewers received their copies of the game only a couple days before its final release date, not providing enough time to really write up reviews that could potentially influence consumers to not buy the game. When those reviews finally did drop, though, boy, they were not kind. Most critics did praise the game's robot character designs, and believed that the game looked pretty darn good. But most of those critics also surmised that those graphics came at a price, namely the overall gameplay of the experience, where the game's controls were simply not good, and felt like several steps back in comparison to then modern tournament fighting titles. Many reviewers complained about the game's lack of meaningful fighting action, the incredibly limited soundtrack and sound effects, and even the much-touted artificial intelligence routines, where most robots could be defeated by simply executing a single flying kick over and over and over again. Despite Mirage's best efforts, Rise of the Robots was shaping up to be a dud, and regardless of which version individuals played, each of which had their own features and limitations, nobody really praised the title as anything more than a valiant effort marred by a focus on style over substance. Interestingly, that didn't stop the game from selling relatively well, and though I couldn't find exact sales figures, it appears to have sold at least 100,000 copies across all versions of the title, a number that was good enough for Mirage to greenlight work on a sequel entitled Rise 2 Resurrection. This game would be a much more expanded effort over the original title, but would, similar to the first game, be met with some pretty damning critiques, with one reviewer stating, and I quote, "The original 16-bit Rise of the Robots was possibly one of the worst fighters ever made. That is, until Rise 2 was released." The only word that springs to mind after reading that review is ouch. History would similarly not be kind to Rise of the Robots, as it would be included in a number of publications' worst games of all time, and would really only be remembered because of its attempt at marrying CGI graphics with tournament fighter gameplay, an attempt that would ultimately be recognized as simply not working. I'll relay my own opinion on the title in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, Rise of the Robots is not a well-respected title amongst the gaming community. After the release of both Rise of the Robots games, Mirage would go on to create the isometric action games Bedlam and Bedlam 2, both of which would receive a fairly mediocre critical response, though would, by all accounts, be more well-received than either Rise of the Robots title, as well as a couple of other titles that never received any degree of critical or commercial success. Unfortunately for Mirage, all of this mediocrity would eventually result in the company closing its doors in 1999, just 7 years after it was first founded. While it might not be widely recognized for any meaningful contributions to the computer and video game industry, you still have to respect the company for what it attempted to do. It may not have succeeded in the eyes of many, but Mirage certainly put forth a valiant effort, and that is certainly something to be commended. While Rise of the Robots never had the impact its creators intended, that doesn't mean it should be forgotten to time entirely. Here is a game that was one of the first titles to utilize incredibly advanced graphics that had up to this point only been used in Hollywood movies, and while those graphics would ultimately be the cause of its eventual downfall, it still represents an interesting release in gaming history, and as such, is one that for many people still deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Rise of the Robots today versus when it was released back in 1994. Before we can dive into how it feels to play Rise of the Robots, I feel like it'd be worthwhile to let everyone in on a little behind the scenes info, especially regarding the way I choose which games to focus on for this podcast. As you might imagine, there are generally a few different reasons as to why I might choose a certain game to play and discuss. Perhaps I think the history would be really interesting to go over and I want to share that with all of you. Or perhaps I have a ton of nostalgia for a particular title and I want to re-experience the feeling of playing something I enjoyed in my youth. Or maybe one of our listeners recommended a title and basically said, "This is amazing, you should go play this." Or sometimes I might feel like playing a certain style of game, either because I really enjoy the style or I'm just in the mood for something a little different. For this particular podcast episode, it was the final situation that inspired me to select Rise of the Robots, because for whatever reason, I had a desire to play a one-on-one fighting game, and I wanted to play something that was a bit more off the beaten path. I didn't feel like playing one of the standard bearers like Street Fighter II or Virtua Fighter or Tekken or any other game that was widely loved and played by countless gamers around the world. I wanted to play something that, while not necessarily obscure, would be something that I had not played extensively before, giving me a new experience to enjoy for the first time. So, as I was thinking about what fighting game to select, I remembered that the 90s had a couple of robot-themed titles that I seem to recall being fairly popular. Though here, I hit a bit of a personal issue. There were two games that immediately sprang to mind in this robot fighting game gaming subgenre, those being One Must Fall 2097 and the other being, of course, Rise of the Robots. Now, I don't have much experience with either title, though based on prior research, I recalled that out of those two games, one was widely considered to be a pretty darn good fighting experience, while the other was considered to be one of the worst games of all time. My issue was I couldn't recall which was which. Would I select a game that many people still claim is still fun to play today, or would I select a game that many people have called, and I quote, absolute trash? I honestly didn't know which was which, so I figured I'd roll the virtual dice to help me decide. And that dice roll is what caused me to end up selecting Rise of the Robots for this particular podcast episode. My only concern, much like Indiana Jones at the end of his third adventure, The Last Crusade, was whether I had chosen poorly or wisely. Anyway, that was the thought process that went into choosing Rise of the Robots to play, and with that out of the way, it's time to dive into talking about the game itself. Rise of the Robots, as we've talked about, is a fighting game pitting a series of robots against each other in 1-versus-1 combat, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. As you play the game, you'll jump, kick, and punch your competition, using a variety of moves to hopefully defeat your opponents en route to an ultimate victory. Along the way, you'll traverse multiple stages, be presented with a variety of cutscenes, and have to figure out the best counters to the various moves your opponents will throw at you. Which is to say, Rise of the Robots is, at its core, very much a one-on-one fighting game in a similar vein to any other one-on-one fighting game you've likely played. But to simply call Rise of the Robots a fighting game and assume it does everything the same way as its peers would be terribly short-sighted, as Rise of the Robots is actually one of the more unique fighting titles I have ever played. And to illustrate why that is, I'd like to go through and talk at length about what makes Rise of the Robots Rise of the Robots. Before that, though, I should mention that all of the impressions I'm about to relay are based on playing the Amiga CD32 version of the game, one of the original versions of the title that had initially released in 1994. As you all know, I prefer to play the original version of games whenever possible, as I want to experience the version of the game that most closely mimics what the developers intended with any given title. In this case, that meant playing the Amiga version of the game, and between going for the floppy-based variant or the CD-based version, I chose the CD version. Anyway, let's talk about Rise of the Robots. To start, I want to go over the character selection process, which, as most of you know, is a core staple of most competitive one-on-one fighting experiences. Well, it turns out that the development team behind Rise of the Robots decided to eliminate that feature entirely, presumably because they figured it would only stand in the way of you getting to the robot destruction action as quickly as possible. Instead, you, as Player 1, will always be cast as the appropriately named Cyborg, a unique human-machine hybrid whose job is to dispatch the rest of the robotic menaces that inhabit Rise of the Robots game world. I should note, though, that if you play a multiplayer match, the second player does in fact get to choose which of 5 different robots he or she can play as, which you might think would be awesome for Player 2. But because Cyborg is such an important character in the overall Rise of the Robots mythos, he is defaulted always as Player 1's character. Which means every single fight, whether in single or multiplayer, will always include Cyborg. This general streamlining and removal of any choice from whomever is playing as Player 1 is something I'd normally complain about, but here it just makes sense because Cyborg is pretty much the most important robot in the known universe, and anyone playing the game only wishes they could control Cyborg constantly. Sucks to be you, Player 2. For my playthrough though, as is often the case, I chose to focus on the single player experience. So luckily, I got to control Cyborg throughout my entire playthrough, and I wasn't tempted by any sort of other robotic choice that could have inadvertently distracted me from my Cyborg mission of cyborgness. Anyway, as I started the game, I was presented with my first robotic opponent, a large, slow-moving machine that seems to have been made to load and unload cargo from ships, dockyards, and other similar locations. As it approached, the game played a short animated cutscene that helpfully presented me with a rundown of the robot's key strengths and weaknesses, using such overly descriptive text as good and low in reference to the robot's overall capabilities. I admit, I was a little taken aback by just how much detail was included in the capability descriptions, and while it took me a while to read the one-word descriptions, mainly because the text updated on the screen so slowly, I kinda wished the development team had reduced the overall detail just a bit, simply to let me get to the action quicker. Finally though, I was dropped into the fight, and I got to experience a fighting game system that is unlike anything I had experienced before. You know how in most fighting games you get to move and punch or kick at the same time, and how multiple buttons are assigned to different punches and kicks, whether high, low, or something in between? Well, don't you worry about anything that complex here, because Rise of the Robots has a system that eliminates the ability to move and hit at the same time. Instead, you hold down your singular attack button, which allows you to build up a power meter of sorts, and then when you're ready to attack, you simply press one of the 4 directions on your controller, and a different move is executed. Press up and you execute a jump kick. Press right and you'll throw a punch. Pressing back will allow you to perform a roundhouse kick, and pressing down will let you duck down, a position from which you can either punch or kick. Altogether, that is 5 whole moves you can execute at any time in the fight, which is so much less than in most other fighting titles that you'll question why this is the first time someone figured out a way of removing nearly all of the interactivity that typically accompanies a fighting game. It certainly makes the act of choosing what moves to use in different situations much more streamlined, which is a novel concept for what is supposed to be a deep fighting title. Not everything was streamlined so significantly though, as the game still uses a combo system for special moves, just like every other fighting game released since around the late 80s. Luckily though, the designers behind Rise of the Robots got rid of all the fluff moves that make fighting games inaccessible for many players, deciding instead to keep just 2 combos for you to use. A flying headbutt, which is executed by pressing down, then up, and then your attack button, and a sliding shoulder tackle, which is executed by pressing left, then right, and then your attack button. Both of these moves, when they land, are devastating to your opponent, so much so that you'll likely question why you would want to use any of the other 5 moves you have at your disposal. We'll get to why you'd want to use something other than those combo moves in a little bit, but suffice it to say, when you're in a fight that you can use those combos, you should. With combos and standard strikes, that makes 7 total moves that you can use to batter and pummel your robotic opponents, along with a block maneuver that can be executed by holding to the left whenever an attack is coming your way. Blocks are fairly effective for the player, but are even more effective for computer-controlled characters, where if an opponent decides all they want to do is block, there is literally nothing you can do to combat that defensive posture. I appreciated the genius of the artificial intelligence at play here, because I know that if I were in a fight and were guaranteed not to take any damage if I simply held my hands in front of my face like a metallic John Cena, you better believe that would be my go-to maneuver. Despite the extreme care that the game's AI was designed with, there are some strategies I was able to discover to help you get through each of the game's fights. And because I found a woeful number of useful strategy guides dedicated to this title, I figured I might as well create my own. So, without further ado, I give to you my surefire top secret strategies for dealing with all of the opponents in the game. The first robot you encounter, like I mentioned earlier, is a fairly standard looking bulky loader style of robot. He's relatively slow and for the most part doesn't do a ton of damage, so he's a good introduction into the wonderful world of Rise of the Robots fighting engine. To come out on top, I recommend you simply execute the sliding shoulder combo constantly. Repeat after me. That's left, then right, then attack. Left, then right, then attack. Repeat those movements like a misguided hokey-pokey styled mantra, and you'll make short work of robot number 1. Robot number 2 is a bit trickier, as he has incredibly strong arms, as the pre-fight text helpfully tells me, and that claim is confirmed when you see the size of his robotic muscles. If I hadn't already purchased my ticket to the gun show, I fear I would have been turned away at the door, but luckily I didn't have to deal with any of that. So, anyway, robot number 2 is very aggressive, and will walk slowly towards you before attempting to swing his big beefy muscled arms at you with what best can be described as the equivalent of a Mike Tyson haymaker in slow motion, and if he connects, you will take a ton of damage. However, I discovered a counter to this seemingly destructive maneuver. You need to jump and kick. Just jump and kick. The way you do this is by holding down your attack button to build power and then press up as soon as the robot gets into striking range. Doing this will knock him back, after which he'll shake off the concussive force of your deadly jump kick attack before beginning to walk back towards you again. If he gets close again, which he will, just remember, jump, then kick, and you should be okay. Although I will say that occasionally robot number 2 does a different move entirely, in which case, good luck, because if he throws off your timing, you will likely be pounded to metallic dust in short order. You can recover from this predicament, but it takes really sharp timing and the ability to, once again, jump and kick. If you can pull that off though, robot number 2 will fall and you'll be on your way to your next fight. Robot number 3 is a much quicker and deadlier adversary, with claws for hands and evil in his mechanical heart. At first glance, he'll likely seem nearly impossible to beat with any regularity, as if he hits you just once, expect a series of additional hits that you may or may not be able to block successfully, which will most likely end with your unceremonious defeat. Luckily for you though, I figured out this super tricky encounter. What you want to do, whenever the robot is approaching your position, is press and hold down your attack button and then press left, which will execute your roundhouse kick. Then when he begins approaching you again, repeat the same maneuver again and again until the robot is no more. Now I should mention that sometimes he'll switch his timing up, in which case you might as well give up right away because AI this intelligent can't be beaten, you can only hope to contain it. If he starts one of his rapid Edward Scissorhands attacks, simply put the controller down and take a swig of your favorite energy drink, because you'll need to improve your focus and timing for the next round. If you get the timing down though, the devastating maneuver of roundhouse kicking your opponent continuously will eventually get you the win, and will allow you to move on to your 4th opponent. This next robot is much quicker than the robots you've faced up to this point, but he also has some difficulty blocking attacks, so much so that even when he blocks, he takes damage. So what I found worked best for me was to repeat the shoulder slide maneuver that worked so well in Fight 1, which, if you need a refresher, is left, then right, then attack. Just repeat that move, left, then right, then attack, and this guy should be beaten without too much difficulty. Robot number 5 is super cool because he's red, so you know he's kind of a big deal. Luckily for you though, I figured out the best strategies for dealing with this red menace, which, like the fight with robot number 4, involves pressing left, then right, then attack, which is your sliding shoulder butt combo. Our red friend doesn't have a great response to that move, so you better believe I'm going to use it, and if you use that move too, I can guarantee you'll come out on top. At this point in your playthrough, you're probably thinking, okay, I think I might be able to beat the game because I've gotten so good at the game's controls and fighting system that no robot can possibly touch me. Well, the game doesn't think you're truly ready. Not yet. So before you can progress to the final fight in the game, you're sent back to the very beginning of the fight sequence and tasked with progressing through each of the 5 fights you just completed one more time. I admit, I was not ready for this explosion of new content, which really does make Rise of the Robots the gift that keeps on giving. When I finally realized what was happening, I found it hard not to suppress a slight chuckle of admiration as I raised a virtual glass to the development team and the clever way in which they designed the game. Getting back to the fights at hand, assuming you follow the strategies I just discussed, you will likely have no issue beating each robot the second time around, because you are that darn good, and after you beat the Red Menace one more time, you'll be faced with the final boss of the game, the T-1000. Oh, wait, no, I mean the Supervisor. The inspiration for the Supervisor's design is pretty clearly worn on his morphing liquid metal exterior, and the first time you see him morph into a spiky weapon of something, you'll likely be concerned for your life. Thankfully, I figured out a strategy that seems to work well, even for this final boss. All you need to do is press left, then right, then attack, and then repeat that move, the incredibly useful sliding shoulder butt combo, until the boss collapses to the ground. And with that, you will have achieved victory, saved the world, and perhaps most importantly, beaten Rise of the Robots. At this point in our discussion, I should mention that Rise of the Robots was marketed as a fighting title by people who ostensibly had played fighting games before, who claimed before release that the game would one-up Street Fighter II and other similar fighting titles of the time. To help achieve that goal, Rise of the Robots was designed unlike any other fighting title ever made. A bold move by the team, and one that I'm sure they were hoping would help them create something truly revolutionary. And revolutionary it certainly was. Because, no, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep up the facade any longer. Guys, I tried to talk about this game positively. I tried to use my normal upbeat attitude to present the game as something that had some degree of merit. I tried. I really did. I even presented the history of the title from the perspective of a team that had great intentions but ultimately failed to deliver on the title's promised features. But I can't do this anymore. I just can't. Rise of the Robots is, to put it mildly, the equivalent of a lead paint-based Transformers toy from the 80s. It has a shiny exterior, but is dangerous to play with, and most likely should be kept away from everyone, assuming you don't want to develop a terminal illness. Rise of the Robots is such a poor game that I found myself wondering how something like this could ever be released. If I were Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, my podcasting career would be over because I would have been turned into a pile of dust and bones. Not only did I not choose wisely when attempting to pick a robotic fighting game to tackle for this episode, but I chose so poorly that I fear I may have developed an inherent distrust for all robot-based fighting games. It takes a special title to turn you off from an entire subgenre of gaming, and I can safely tell you, Rise of the Robots is exactly that kind of game. We're going to talk more about my unfiltered opinion of the various aspects of the game in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Because back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have a ton of gameplay videos we could look up. If we were going to buy a game, most of the time that decision was based on either word of mouth, reviews we might have read in magazines, or what the box in the game store looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd flip it over. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Rise of the Robots, and this is for the DOS version of the title because I could not find a good image of the Amiga version of the game, the back of the box says, "When robots rise, there can be no mercy. Metropolis 4, a city-state dependent on robot-run industry, a city under siege. At ElectroCore, the largest manufacturer of military and industrial robots, a malignant ego virus has corrupted the robot workers' behavioral programming. A seductive sensation has been added to the newly created pleasure center in their CPUs. Its name? Destruction/joy. There is but one way to end the rampant evil. A champion must be found. You are chosen, part man, part machine. You are the cyborg. You must challenge the most aggressive robots ever engineered, each equipped with artificial intelligence, each capable of anticipating your every move, each with only one objective: destroy. You must battle 5 robot fighters of unparalleled strength and skill before squaring off against the ultimate challenger, the supervisor. Her speed and accuracy are lethal. Her evil melting morphing ability, deadly. Prepare for the most intense showdown ever." And then there are some bullets which say 1 and 2 player modes, original score by legendary rock guitarist Brian May, 3D visual contouring allows robots to exist in a realistic environment, up to 100 frames of animation support, fluid robot movements. Sophisticated punch detection matrix, what the heck is that, enhances playability. And artificial intelligence allows robots to learn and anticipate, creating increasingly difficult fight sequences. And then there are screenshots of each of the robots with a little catchphrase. So you have the red guy, it says, "You can't run without legs." You have the big arm guy, which says, "Read your gravestone, sucker." Then you have the agile robot, which says, "Find out if there's life after death." The next one, the claw guy, says, "Burial or cremation." The loader robot says, "You have been warned." And then the supervisor finally says, "Mercy is a human trait." And that is the back of the box for Rise of the Robots, and I've got to say, I'm a little bit torn on this one. Knowing what I do now, I would have never picked this box up on the shelf, but I will say the box does kind of look cool, especially the front of the box with the graphics that they show. It does actually look kind of cool. The back of the box, I don't know. I don't know that they fully sold me on the title based on the back of the box write-up. The screenshots made the game look kind of good from a graphics perspective, but it felt a little hokey to me, I think. I don't know. I don't know that I would have purchased this one if I saw the box on the shelf. And in fact, I did see the box on the shelf back when I was younger, and I intentionally didn't buy it. But the reason I didn't buy it is because I'm not a huge fighting game guy. I'm not a big tournament fighter kind of competitor, so I probably just passed it by because of that, not because of any intrinsic issue with the box itself. Still, looking at it today, I don't know. I'd give it probably a 50-50 as to whether I would purchase the box just based on looking at the box. Of course, that might be a little bit of my bias speaking through because I do in fact know what is in the box, and knowing that, I cannot recommend you buy this one. But we're going to talk more about why that is as we go through the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Rise of the Robot are, from my perspective, the highlight of the experience, as the pre-rendered visuals really do look more advanced than many other titles created around the time of the game's release, in a good way. You can see exactly where the budget for this game was spent, because the environments, the characters, and even the cutscenes that play out at the beginning of the game and in between fights all look pretty darn good for a title from 1994. The visuals don't quite hold up to today's standards, and as with many earlier 3D rendered titles, Rise of the Robots has a distinctive look that will likely feel similar, and perhaps even nostalgic, to anyone who lived through the early to mid-90s era of gaming, as plenty of developers were experimenting with pre-rendered visuals to give their games a higher degree of visual fidelity. Rise of the Robots is no different in this regard, and if the game were simply a series of slideshow images, I think it would have worked just fine, and in fact, may have been better than the actual gameplay that was included in the title. We'll talk more about that in just a couple minutes, but suffice it to say, the graphics here were a real highlight, especially in comparison to everything else the game had to offer. Less of a highlight were the animations for each robotic combatant, and here I use the term animations pretty loosely. Because, unlike most games that present animations as a series of interpolated keyframes that gradually morph from one to another, in Rise of the Robots, you have the equivalent of a sped-up stop-motion animation, and not in a good way. Every motion and movement in the game feels super stiff and slow, and you'd be forgiven for thinking the Amiga CD32 is simply not powerful enough to render the game effectively, because the game feels like a title that is simply too advanced for the platform on which it's running. In reality, that's not the case. The game's animations are just designed really poorly. I should also mention that one of the few game options included here actually does have an effect on the visuals, and that is whether you display shadows for each character or not. Now, I feel like we need to talk about shadows in games, a historically difficult graphics effect to get right, and one that for years required significant graphics horsepower to render with any degree of speed or acceptable performance. The shadows in Rise of the Robots are truly one of the laziest implementations of shadows I have ever seen in a game, as they are literally just a slightly less amorphous blob floating under your character, which I recognize as a shadowing technique that plenty of games have used in the past. The thing is, most of the time, those other games using such a simple shadowing mechanic don't experience much, if any, impact to their underlying performance, because it doesn't take too much computing power to render a super simple dark circle under your character. Well, Rise of the Robots is unlike those other titles because even the simplistic shadowing mechanic included in the game is enough to make the gameplay dramatically slower. But you know what? That performance hit is actually a godsend, because if you try to play the game without shadows, you'll face much quicker robotic enemies who can literally destroy you within seconds if you don't time your moves just right. And because the control scheme for this title is so uniquely bad, you'll likely face great difficulty trying to fight these sped-up robot assassins. Regardless of my complaints about the animations and speed of the graphics though, I can't deny that the game's visuals, if simply looked at as static graphics, look pretty darn good, especially when you consider that the game was released in 1994. Moving on to the sound and music. You know how in most fighting games you have at least one or two really catchy themes for different characters that you'll likely hum, reminisce about, or seek out on YouTube to listen to an a cappella arrangement of? Well, there's none of that here, because there is next to no music in Rise of the Robots. At all. And it's actually so bad that I feel like Time Warner Interactive could potentially be sued for false advertising. And the reason for that false advertising is the fact that the game's development team spent a ton of time hyping up the music for the game, which they publicized was being created by Brian May, the legendary guitarist from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame musical group Queen, like we talked about earlier. Some versions of the game, like the DOS version, even call out Brian May's involvement with the title on the game's box, highlighting that feature as something that was believed would help sell the game to prospective consumers. Having played the whole game, I can safely say that if Brian May had a track in the game, it played for less time than was required for me to actually recognize the track as a piece of music by Brian May. And I'm not being hyperbolic. Brian May's involvement must have been limited to mere seconds, if that. I would have personally had a real issue advertising Brian May's music as a core feature of the game, had I known that in reality, he was barely present at all. Now you might say, okay, that's fine, I'm sure there's other music to listen to throughout the game. Only to that, I would say, nope, not really, because there is really only the slightest bit of music included in the title, most of which plays either on the game's menu or during the game's credits. Outside of those two scenes, there is no music to speak of at all. The majority of the game's fights, or actually all of the game's fights, consist solely of mechanical whirring in the background as you and your robotic opponent face off against each other. A fact that I considered might have been an emulation error as opposed to an actual design choice, though it turns out I was wrong. There really is no music in the title other than a couple of short musical pieces that play on the game's menu and the ending credits. For what it's worth, other versions of the title beyond the Amiga-based versions did add some additional music to the experience, and it's those musical tracks that you're hearing as interlude pieces in this podcast episode. I wanted to include music from the Amiga version as well, but there's just not enough there to warrant any degree of appreciation. It's so bare bones that it's not even worth any further discussion. Sound effects, meanwhile, were there, but were entirely forgettable, and I can't honestly say they contributed to the experience. Bottom line, the auditory environment for Rise of the Robots was pretty awful, and there's really not much else to say about it. Moving on to the narrative and story, Rise of the Robots takes place in the distant future, where a megacorporation known as ElectroCore is effectively the biggest corporation in the entire world, delivering technological and robotic advancements the likes of which the world had never seen. As you might imagine, ElectroCore has been incredibly successful, so much so that the demand for their products far outweighs the company's ability to make and deliver those products. So, one day, the leadership at ElectroCore decides on a new path forward. Rather than rely on human intervention to run their factories, which was deemed inefficient, what if they could design a central artificial intelligence to effectively run everything that needed to be run, and in the process, make things even more efficient and therefore sustainable? That sounded like a solid plan that couldn't possibly go wrong, so they created the proposed centralized AI made up of millions of nanobots and then let it begin running their company. Robots being robots, it didn't take long before they'd start to get a mind of their own, literally, as a rogue virus would infect ElectroCore's central AI, and from that point on, the AI became slightly less reliable, and also developed a bit of a superiority complex, taking over ElectroCore's robotic denizens and turning them against their organic creators, with an eventual intention of taking over the world. Recognizing that the only way to fight robots would be with other robots, the team at ElectroCore sends in Cyborg, a cybernetic robotic creature with the strength and speed of a superhuman, in order to fight the growing robotic threat plaguing ElectroCore's factories. You take on the role of Cyborg, and throughout the game you will jump, kick, and punch your way through a variety of bad guys in the hopes of reaching the final fight to, with any luck, defeat the rogue AI along with the deadly virus that had infected it, and save the world. So this story, honestly, I don't have any particular feelings about this one way or another. It's fine for what it is, and as a fighting game, the fact that there's any story here at all is a bonus, because most of the time, fighting games are focused on punching people in the face, not necessarily enjoying a deep and engrossing narrative. From that perspective, the story works here, but it's also nothing I would call out as being particularly impressive. And actually, I think that's a missed opportunity, because the lore behind the game world might have been interesting if a little bit more care was placed here. Think about it for a second, and forget all of the other flaws with the game. Let's say you had a roster of available robotic fighters, each of whom had detailed stats, strengths, weaknesses, perhaps even creators who imbued them with individual traits that served to distinguish their fighting styles from each other. That might have been pretty cool to have in the game. Instead, we get very generic descriptions of each robot, and in the main fights themselves, the robot names aren't even used. The fighters are simply listed as Robot 1 and Robot 2, which, come on, that's just stupidly generic. Anyway, I'm not saying that a tweak here would save the game, but it might have added a little bit of additional shine to an otherwise lackluster experience. Moving on to the playability and controls, there is so much to talk about here, and I want to try to make sure I hit on everything so that you all have an informed understanding of the game that I played for a couple hours on an otherwise boring Sunday afternoon. I'm going to warn you up front, though, that I'm about to be pretty harsh on the title, simply because, from my perspective, this is not a good game. To start, let's talk about the controls, which, like we talked about, effectively involves using an attack button combined with directional inputs to execute various moves and attacks. On paper, that sounds like any other fighting title, but the key difference here is that anything resembling fluidity of gameplay is absolutely missing from the game. Can you imagine a fighting game where you need to stand still in order to execute a punch or a kick? Well, you don't have to, because Rise of the Robots is that game. I can't tell you how handcuffed I felt playing the title, realizing that in order to attack, I effectively had to stay stationary and bide my time for my opponent to approach me. This is not a fast-paced experience. Now, some of you might be thinking something to the effect of, well, not every fighting game needs to be a super action-fueled, fast-paced kind of experience. And yes, I agree with that assertion 100%, and there are fighting games that require slower-paced and more methodical strategies to succeed, like the PlayStation title Bushido Blade, which I haven't played recently, but is one I absolutely loved when I was younger. The key difference here is that there is no strategy in Rise of the Robots, unless you consider exploiting obvious AI weaknesses to be a strategy, in which case, Rise of the Robots is more strategic than the entire Command & Conquer series rolled into one. The issue is that the controls are so simple, yet so non-responsive, and the gameplay is so straightforward, yet so slow and clunky, that there is a surprising amount of room for error, despite the inherent flaws in the game's AI fighters, and the controls in no way provide an engaging way to interface with the game. And that's not even touching upon the fact that the game's roster of moves is downright paltry. It feels like a title from the early 80s, not one released after other seminal fighting games had already made their way to market. If the game at least played well, the smaller number of moves wouldn't be as big of a deal. But the playability here is absolutely awful, and even more so than the controls, presents a number of baffling design decisions that I can't imagine real people making in 1994. Like, for example, how you can't actually select your fighter in a fighting game. What were the designers thinking? How could the team have possibly found this acceptable? Look, I know the reason for this was because of the insane render times for the various characters. I totally get it. But just look at this from the perspective of a player, as opposed to from the perspective of a development team trying to ship their title. And further, assume for a moment that the game was actually good. If you see all of these cool-looking robotic characters, a natural curiosity might be, I wonder what it feels like to play as them. Well, you'll never be able to scratch that itch, because unless you play as Player 2 in a multiplayer battle, you'll never be able to play as anyone other than Cyborg. I understand the reality of the situation the development team faced, but from my perspective, creating a fighting title with literally no character choice was still a really strange decision, and I wonder if a delay would have actually been better than releasing this obviously hamstrung effort. Anyway, the lack of a character selection and all of the considerations surrounding that design decision is far from the only issue with the playability of the game. You also have the fact that there are no continues in the game, at all. While each fight does consist of a best of 3 rounds kind of structure, if you lose 2 of those rounds, regardless of how far you are in the game, you get sent back to the very beginning of the title. Luckily, the game isn't that long of an experience, so it's not a huge blow, but because the game is so unfun to play, any additional time spent being required to play the title feels entirely unnecessary, and for the first time in a long time, I contemplated using save states simply to reduce my time with the game. I ultimately persevered, but it was not a fun experience. The issue is that the game's AI is so stupid, it sometimes rolls right back around to becoming insanely powerful, and if you mess up the timing of one of the so-called strategies I mentioned earlier, expect to get roughed up badly, if not destroyed outright. The biggest offender here is the third robot, the claw-based blender of destruction, who, if he catches you, will simply unleash a flurry of assaults that will lock you in place without much of anything you can do to counter his endless attack. If you avoid getting in that position by kicking him at the right moment in his animation, repeatedly, he becomes trivial. But miss one kick, and you might as well call it quits, because he will almost certainly destroy you. Other robots have similar issues, to a lesser degree, where if you get caught by an unexpected attack, you can end up being pummeled mercilessly, which is not fun. I tried to play the game as I would play any other fighting title, with a variety of moves, strikes, and combo maneuvers, but the game actively worked against me here, so much so that I had no issue using the one move for each fight that would trivialize that specific encounter. I typically wouldn't condone such behavior, but the controls are so poorly conceived, and the gameplay is so ridiculously designed, that I ended up making peace with my decision fairly early on in my playthrough. And speaking of my playthrough, the overall length of time required to beat the game is pretty short, with a full victory lap maybe taking 20 to 25 minutes or so, with much of that time spent either watching or attempting to skip the between-fight cutscenes that take ages to load, play, and skip. Luckily, the version of the game I played had an option to skip cinematics, which I ended up doing after realizing it existed, after which watching each cutscene at least once just to know what it was, and then I just went on with my fights. That sped up the pace of the game dramatically, as every fight simply followed one another, and interestingly, my enjoyment of the experience actually increased, if only slightly, without having to wait for an extended period of time for each fight to load. Without cinematics, this is probably a 7-ish minute game, and that includes the fact that you're forced to fight the same robot combatants twice before making your way to the final boss of the game. As you might expect, I have some opinions about padding out the content by simply making you go through the same fights twice, which to me, once again, is lazy game design. I can imagine the meeting now. What would be better than having players experience 5 uninspired fights before facing the final boss? Well, having players experience 5 uninspired fights twice before facing the final boss. Honestly, why? This feels like another one of those decisions driven by the fact that they likely couldn't render more enemies in the storage space they had available to them. So rather than create a fully fleshed out roster of characters, the team simply settled with the 5 they had and made you fight them twice. I am not a fan of this kind of design in a fighting title, especially because the second set of fights are not appreciably different from your first encounter with each robot. I've read that the second set of fights is meant to demonstrate the adaptive artificial intelligence at play, where the game develops new strategies to fight against you given your performance during the first round of fights. But that sounds like marketing fluff to me, because the same repetitive strategies that worked in the first round of fights worked in the second. I did notice some slightly different timing for a couple of the robots, which I guess is something, but none of those shifts were enough to really impact each fight. Though I will say, randomly dying to a robot in the second set of fights and having to go all the way back to the beginning of the first round of fights is not a great feeling to experience. I don't attribute those losses to the AI becoming better though. I simply attribute those to missed timing on my part, which by the way, is sometimes driven by the controls simply not registering your inputs, which I totally forgot to mention when we were talking about controls earlier. Because you don't have the ability to attack immediately, given the existence of your power-up bar, you can sometimes be charging up an attack only to get hit by an enemy, which means you may or may not need to let go of your attack button and recharge your power meter before being allowed to attack. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and it feels entirely random as to what situation you'll find yourself in. There were plenty of times where I changed up an attack and went to execute it, only to see my robot stand completely still as though his internal computer was going through a forced reboot. Seriously frustrating. Anyway, I won't belabor the point anymore. Rise of the Robots controls poorly, it does not play well, and it should be avoided by everyone. It is literally an atrocious game, and it feels atrocious to play. There are so few redeeming qualities here that even my normal, overly optimistic self is finding it difficult to talk about the game with any degree of positivity. This is one slog of an experience, and I can't imagine anyone sitting down to play this one without thinking, I have made a huge mistake. Though with all that said, I need to be clear that I only played the Amiga CD32 version of the title, the original version of the game that, along with the Amiga and DOS releases, make up what I would consider to be the baseline Rise of the Robots experience. Different ports feature different degrees of competency, with some doing away with the strike power-up requirement and the whole you can't move and attack at the same time silliness, while others improved the responsiveness of the gameplay, while others still allowed you to actually play the game like a real fighting game as opposed to some odd experiment in how to regress a genre by 10 years. I didn't personally experience any of those ports, but I can say based on looking at gameplay videos that some of them look dramatically better than the version of the game I played. According to reviews, those alternate versions are still considered to be pretty poor experiences, but as always, I won't pass judgment on those titles without first playing them myself. What I can pass judgment on though is the Amiga CD32 version of the title, which is, quite frankly, a really bad game. So what is our verdict on Rise of the Robots? Well, it should go without saying, but Rise of the Robots is the quintessential definition of a footnote in gaming history. Outside of the graphics, there is nothing positive to note throughout the entire experience, and it certainly seems like the team behind the game decided to focus almost exclusively on the game's visuals to the detriment of everything else. It was certainly a decision, though from my perspective, it wasn't a good one. Unlike nearly every other game I've played in recent memory, and certainly more so than any game we've played for this podcast, Rise of the Robots fails to deliver even a modicum of fun, and I seriously walked away from the experience feeling like I had just wasted 2 hours of my life that I'll never get back. This game is undeniably the worst game I have played in the last couple years, by far, and is likely one of the worst games I've ever played, period. As such, Rise of the Robots is more than deserving of its spot as the newest member of our footnotes in gaming history. That was our episode on Rise of the Robots. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it way more than I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Alex Kidd in Miracle World, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I am hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow our community and continue to try to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Alex Kidd in Miracle World. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.